And good afternoon once again to Bloomberg Opinion Editorial Board Conversations. I'm your host, Robert George, or I should say I'm usually your host, Robert George. My colleagues on the editorial board got sick and tired of me pelting them with questions every single week, so we've decided to turn the tables and have one of my colleagues talk to me about a recent editorial up on our site on gun violence and research and so forth, given some comments recently from the CDC. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Mark Whitehouse, and hope that he doesn't embarrass me too much over the next 15 minutes as we talk about this important topic.
All right. Thank you, Robert. So here I go. Hello, and welcome to Bloomberg Opinion's Editorial Conversations, where we unmask the humans behind our unsigned editorials. I'm Mark Whitehouse, and it's my pleasure to welcome Robert George, a fellow member of the Bloomberg Opinion Editorial Board. We'll be talking about the Biden administration's approach to gun violence, a topic on which Robert has written an editorial that you can find on the Bloomberg Opinion Twitter feed and in many other places. So one of the things I find most striking is that despite the fact that gun violence is the second leading cause of death in the United States, for decades, the government hasn't been doing research on exactly what's driving it and what to do about it. How did that happen?
Well, interesting story there. And this basically goes back to the 1990s when the CDC actually did, in a sense, what they're doing now, trying to elevate the idea of gun violence into a public health question. And that created, within the context of the Clinton administration, some serious political blowback, particularly after the Republicans took over Congress. And so a congressman from Arkansas, Jay Dickey, added an amendment to one of the must-pass budget bills that placed restrictions on what the CDC and other federal agencies could do with gun research. Basically, their argument was that the federal government was, in a sense, trying to kind of game the system by using gun research to advocate for gun control. So they wrote explicit language saying that you could not use gun research to advocate or promote gun control. And at the same time, they cut out about $2 million from the CDC budget from a recent study of theirs, which argued that there was a link between the idea of if there was a gun in the home, there might be a greater likelihood of gun violence. And so, because of that, the CDC ended up, pardon the expression, becoming gun shy over the next couple of decades, and almost all research from the federal level dried up over the next quarter century.
So why is it that we need the federal government to do the research, or the government to do the research? I mean, isn't private research enough? Don't universities have adequate resources to do this, or do private researchers kind of depend on the government to produce the data they need to?
Right, it's the latter. There is a lot of private research there. There's a lot of academic research out there. In full disclosure, Michael Bloomberg actually funds some gun research at Johns Hopkins, for example. So there is a lot out there. But to make an example, take a look at automobile accidents. There's federal research and there's private research and so forth in terms of car safety and all of these kind of things. But the private sector, the academic sectors, and so forth depend on objective numbers that really only the federal government can really track in terms of different incidents across the states. That's what happens in the context of automobile accidents. But over the last 25 years, for example, the federal government's research on guns is like 1.6% of what it does in terms of providing research in automobile accidents. So that kind of shows you the disparity, and it makes it harder, or I should say, it has made it harder for private researchers to get, say, apples to apples comparisons in some of these numbers. And I should say, and this is the key point. In 2018 is when and this is interesting because it came under the Trump administration, and it was even before the Democrats took over control of Congress. Congress did pass legislation that explicitly said that gun violence research should restart. And so we're starting to now see a little bit more coming from the federal government in terms of encouraging some of these outside efforts.
So, pardon me, a little bit of a traffic jam outside there.
This is New York, exactly.
Yeah. So what kinds of questions, what are the most urgent questions that need answering? Is the problem the sheer volume of guns, the kinds of guns, something else? I mean, what do we know and what do we need to know?
It's a mixture. For one thing, we know tragically whenever there's a mass shooting, everybody starts focusing on assault weapons and so forth. But the fact is, assault weapons are a very small proportion of contributing to gun deaths. Handguns are still a major issue in terms of suicides, in terms of street crime and so forth. But again, we don't have complete numbers on those, and that would be helpful in terms of the discussion. So like, for example, would restrictions on assault weapons reduce violence? And we don't really know that. What best practices might there be out there to prevent suicides, homicides, or even accidental injuries? What reforms are there to impede mass shootings and so forth? And we also know this is something that comes out of this is something that comes out. It's something that both sides might agree on. There is a mental health component to this, which is something that does argue for what the CDC has been saying, that there needs to be a public health discussion where we can talk about both the gun violence on one side, mental health on the other.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, are there other countries that have as many guns as we do? In one word, no. I mean, the U.S. The U.S. Leads in gun ownership by a large amount. In fact, I don't know, but yes. Now we know, and this is kind of tragic. The U.S. Leads in a number of categories of accidental and intentional deaths, both in guns, automobile accidents, and things like that. The price of freedom in the United States can be seen in a number of dark statistics, but again, making that contrast with car accidents, we
we know what we need to do to make driving safer, and we pass seatbelt laws and airbags and things like that. Whereas there's just a vast gap in the discussion on guns and gun safety.
Mm-hmm. So you were writing about an interview that CDC Director Rochelle Walensky gave, in which she elevated gun violence to a public health issue. So why is that significant?
Well, first of all, she is really the first CDC director to do that, basically since the early '90s under the Clinton administration. So that's significant. Now there are critics of the administration who think that the CDC should, to use a cliche, stay in its lane, particularly given that we're still dealing with a pandemic. But I think this is actually a legitimate conversation if the CDC is arguing in good faith. And there was something rather interesting in Dr. Walensky's interview last month, where she tried to extend an olive branch to gun owners. Maybe not necessarily with the NRA. There's not going to be. I don't think there's going to be a sit down anytime soon in that area. But there is something of a gap between the gun lobby, the National Rifle Association, and just regular gun owners who may very well have good legitimate advice to give to the to share with the government in terms of how can they possibly reduce suicides? How can they reduce accidental deaths? Is there, can there be a discussion on, how do you, safely, how do you safely keep guns in the house, and how do you and if there are kids, how do you have that conversation with young people if there are guns around, either to stay away from them, or how to use them safely. There is, sadly, a lot of skepticism and suspicion of in terms of both sides, between the gun safety side and the gun rights side. If Walensky can really create a space where these two sides can have a good faith discussion, that's that's all to the best.
So who would represent? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm hearing you. I'm hearing you, Mark. You just blanked out there for a moment.
So who would represent the responsible gun owners? I mean, what if the CDC opens up the table and nobody shows up? Do you think her olive branch is genuine or purely politics?
I mean, in any kind of a case like this, there is some politics, and the gun rights, the NRA, obviously, I would argue is not going to see this as a good faith argument, but polls suggest that there's a wide gap between some of the responsible gun safety suggestions that are being debated, whether it has to do with background checks, or whether it has to do with some of the red flag laws. Now, again, the civil libertarians are wary that they might have, like, a family member would say, oh, my sister threatened me with something, and she needs to have a gun, take it away. I think there has to be those kind of considerations should be taken into account. But the average person at home, thinks that something like is wise public policy. So and gun owners and the poll suggests that gun owners believe that as well. So I mean, I think there is some space for discussion. And the question is though whether Director Walensky or President Biden are able to open up that space, open up that area for discussion, and bring some of the gun owners to the table.
One last question: if research can help curb deaths and broaden support for legitimate gun ownership, why would the gun lobby be opposed?
That is that's a great question. I mean, from a political standpoint, they, I think, argue that that the research might be twisted, and they might not, particularly coming from a Democratic, capital D Democratic administration. They would be wary that it's just going to be more subterfuge to try and push more gun control legislation. The question is, though, I think definitely we should encourage more research from all areas to try and to find some middle ground, because you want to have, more research is better than less research. And even Jay Dickey, as I said, the congressman who initially put in this amendment that shrunk the parameters of research, before he passed away a couple of years ago, he said that he realized that he had made a mistake, and he said that we do need the research. And so hopefully, now that the federal government is back in the business there, all of society and all of this conversation may fully benefit.
I promised that was the last question, but I just got a question from the metaverse. So a small percentage of gun owners own a big chunk of all the guns in the U.S. Are those people likely to join this discussion? I guess I would add to that, do you see any evidence that that the Biden administration is seeking to make contact with them?
That's a good question, and my sense is that the individuals that have the most guns are the ones that are most skeptical of big government coming to infringe on those rights. I think the ones who would be most open to this are those, actually, possibly some with many of those in the law enforcement community, for example, who quite rightly can be wary about how many guns are out there in terms of their own safety, and the average person who feels it's important to have a gun in the household for personal protection, and it should be. This is actually something that came to light over the last couple of years during the pandemic. There have been more people purchasing guns who don't, kind of fit into that stereotype of the white guy in the South, so forth. You're starting to see more women. More women purchasing guns, more minorities purchasing guns. These are the people, I think, who are open to having a legitimate conversations on how to keep guns in the household safely, and limit suicides, limit homicides, and limit accidental deaths. And so I think those are some of the people that the Biden administration would probably be wisest trying to reach out to.
Great, Robert. Thank you so much. I've taken more than my fair share of your time. to everybody out there, thank you for joining us.